Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Enrichment. Our guest this week is James Thornton, who is the CEO and founder of ClientEarth. ClientEarth are a group of international lawyers who use the power of the law to force governments and corporations to take steps to protect the environment. So James is speaking about the work that they do. They have a number of successful cases already that they have achieved, and many cases running currently. Another question from Francis about the UK's first deep coal mine going ahead. And this has been
in Cumbria.
Yes, yeah. No, it's it's not a good idea. It's what's interesting is that the guy who runs, it was one of the big coal companies. It might have been Tata, Steel. Could have been Tata Steel, UK division, who is saying, look, they're saying they need to create. So the argument is it's a very special type of coal used in the production of steel. It's not normal coal that you burn in coal-fired power stations, and we're going to need this for a very long time. That's not what the guys who are the most progressive people in the steel industry say. They said quite explicitly, this is a mistake. It shouldn't happen. The UK should instead be investing a lot in using hydrogen to burn to produce steel. It is something that you can substitute. It needs a bit more work, but everybody really looking at it thinks that you'll be able to move from coking steel to hydrogen. You just need to make it work. So the idea of building, a coal mine that's going to be producing for decades, what it will also do is two other things. It will, under the way the UK works on climate, there's a climate change committee made up of scientists, terrific group. And it's chaired by a Tory called Lord Deben, friend of mine. He's a terrific guy. And they come up with this budget. And the idea is, the budget for emissions goes down and down and down between now and 2050, when everything is promised to be net zero, so no emissions. And what the Committee on Climate Change said is this coal mine will break that budget because it will produce lots of emissions. And
will it have impacts to the surrounding areas?
They claim that it will have not much by way of impacts to the surrounding areas because they're going to cover it over with tents, and that maybe. But the thing is that coal mines, if you burn the coal, which is the point, have a global impact because the climate is global. So, it's, and the other thing about it, which is, politically really bad. I wrote a letter to Boris Johnson the other day with CEOs of 80 other organizations saying, look, you're the host of the global meeting on climate, COP26 in Glasgow in November of this year, in which the UK is the host of all the governments of the world coming together to tighten up their promises about climate change. And the hope is that all of the important countries get together and reduce, really reduce by a short time the amount of carbon they're emitting. And it's very hard politically to say we're opening a coal mine that's going to run until 2049. Meanwhile, we'd really like you to cut down your carbon emissions. It skews the conversation in a really bad way. So I think there are a lot of reasons it's not.
Do you think it's going to go ahead?
Well, we don't know yet. The reason we wrote the letter is that it was given provisional approval by the local council, which is the way the planning law works.
Yeah, Cumbria County Council.
That's correct. And but the central government can call it in, as the term, and say we have reason not to allow it to go forward. I've just given you lots of reasons. So Boris Johnson's government can call it in and say, we don't think this should be built. It's not the way we want to go forward. So hopefully that's what happens. Now, there are a couple of local groups who have gotten lawyers to work for them, and I expect there'll be legal challenges if the government is dumb enough to go ahead.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question about just like how you predict the future, kind of, if you can do that at all. I don't know. Like, how do you see London being in like 15 years?
Well, I mean, London could be in amazingly great shape in 15 years. You know, the cool thing is, I mean, we're really at a point where we can choose to do everything in a much better way, or we can
continue down the same path.
Collapse. You know, we can collapse, or we can thrive. So London has the potential for remaining one of the world's best cities. And maybe the best, and to demonstrate lots of things. You know, one of the things that the mayor is talking about. So the mayor has been among the mayors of the all of the cities and towns in the UK, the leading one in terms of trying to clean up the air. So that's where we started the story. Sadiq Khan is very, very vigorous about trying to clean up the air, and so 15 years from now, you'll have much, much cleaner air in London, which is in itself a wonderful thing. You'll be walking down the street and you will be healthier. There are other things that can happen. So he's looking to green London in a major way, which I hope happens. You know, they're looking to put in a tremendous number of charging points for electric vehicles, which would be great. We're working with a lot of people to try and make London the center of green finance, or one of the. We're also working with Singapore to make it the Asian center.
What do you mean by green finance?
A number of things. So one is that so the basic idea is you want to follow the money, right? Where the money goes determines what happens in the world. So the money will either go into building renewable energy or into building coal mines. You know, and what you want to do is to set up the system so that it's much more attractive for investors to invest in the right thing. The right thing meaning, you know, clean energy. So that's a big part of it. And then forcing investors to do the right thing when they won't is another part of it. So we've changed the laws so that pension funds now have to report on the climate impact of their investment. That will help change things. And then there's this whole new area of green bonds, which I'm not an expert in which investment in green things gives you good returns. But in terms of what interests me is making companies show what they're doing, and then changing the rules so that the investors see what's happening in companies, so they can begin to make the right investment decisions, and then simply taking the worst things off the table, like coal-fired power stations.
Is it more expensive to invest in green energy, like renewable energy, rather than coal and like burning energies? Because why aren't the investors already all wanting to move towards like renewable?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So no, the numbers are shocking. I'll tell you how good the numbers are, and then we'll get to the question why isn't the market just moving that way? But over the last 10 years, the price of renewables has fallen very dramatically. It's something like I was looking at it the other day. It's something like solar is 80% cheaper than it was 10 years ago, and wind is 60% cheaper or something like that, and big batteries are something like 85% cheaper. And the numbers are something like that. Now that's really dramatic. And you know, an economist at Oxford was showing me his graph that, you know, out of all inventions that have happened since the Industrial Revolution, nothing has fallen in price as quickly and in cost as quickly as renewable energy. So it is much, much cheaper. You know, it's and all over the world. I was talking to somebody who builds renewable energy systems in Asia the other day, and he was saying now anywhere in Asia, he can build for you a renewable energy system that is tremendously cheaper than a fossil fuel system. So why isn't it happening? Well, there's a lot of inertia in the system, and there are companies that have been doing the same thing for a very long time who want to keep doing. So RWE, for example, a huge energy producer burning coal in Europe, wants to keep burning coal as long as it can. That's what it knows how to do. Now, 50 years ago, that seemed like a good idea. We didn't really know much about climate change, and burning coal seemed like a good idea. So governments and these companies establish very deep relationships. So governments are intertwined with them, and governments have a hard time telling them to do differently or pushing them out of the road. If you imagine this road, as I do, and these new, smart, young companies want to come down the road to deliver renewable energy, but you have these fat old companies sitting in the road like dinosaurs, and the governments aren't going to push the dinosaurs aside because they're in bed with them. The dinosaurs are not going to get out of the way on their own, because that's not what dinosaurs do, right? I mean, famously, that's not what they do. It takes a meteor. So, these renewable energy companies aren't designed to sue these huge, small, clever renewable energy companies, to sue these vast companies. And that's then why citizens like us at ClientEarth need to come in and sue these huge companies. So you take out your sword and you slash and try and move the company out of the road. And that is working. I mean, that's the main reason why you stop all these coal-fired power stations. So it's a long answer to your question, but the renewables are cheaper, they are better, they are healthier. They are over the last few years, they're actually producing the investment in renewable energy is one of the best things if you were an investor. It's one of the best investments you could be making. Investments have been doing amazingly well. An investor told me the other day that he was making 3 times what the standard return on the market was by investing in green energy. Now that's pretty good. So there are a lot of reasons to do it, but there's a lot of blockage, and the blockage needs to get moved.
Right. There's a question earlier from Ruby, which I think you've partly answered really, but Ruby talking about is the government prioritizing the economy above the need to protect the climate and the environment?
Well, it's a great thing to go back to. I mean, so what very smart people who are economists are saying. So the guy at Oxford who runs the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, or Mark Carney, who was the governor of the Bank of England until very recently, a very, very smart economist. What these very smart economists who are literate, very literate in the environment are saying is it's a much better deal for the economy. It's a much better investment for if you want to build a healthy economy to invest in green, and it creates far more jobs. So you'll have a just transition, and it produces far better results for human health. There was a new study that just came out today. It's in The Guardian, saying that fossil fuels, mostly air pollution, but from fossil fuels, causes something like $2.9 trillion a year loss through the health impacts to human beings around the world. So that's the sort of pressure you can pull off the economy by investing in green. And you see some smart people in power wanting to do this. So the European Union has decided its Green Deal is to make all of the money. So the ambition is to make all of the money the EU spends, which is considerable, actually advance green interests. So, for example, they would invest in renewable energy and not in fossil fuel. The Biden administration wants to spend $1.9 trillion as part of its new COVID recovery package. And if they get their way, a lot of that will be green investment. A lot of it will be investment in renewable energy and in infrastructure for clean vehicles, for example. And you're seeing China too. I mean, we're working closely with the Chinese on their huge investment in something like 100 countries outside of China, and working on a system which I think will work, and I think they'll adopt, which will mean that all of their foreign investment, again, moves away from brown and into green, so that it's investment in health, it's investment in the future of civilization. So you have to do it. But what the smart economists are saying, which is very good, is that it's also good for the economy. Now, this wasn't the case when I was 25 and doing this. People used to say, well, you're very altruistic and you want clean energy and you want to do nice things for people, but it's not economic. And the biggest thing that's happened for the environmental domain and our ability to say we can actually do this and get it done and change the course of civilization is the economics has shifted so fundamentally.
Weston is asking about how much damage has already been done health-wise. He says, will some generations of children who went through more polluted times have less developed lungs or damaged lungs and therefore, suffer health-wise in the future?
Well, sadly, the answer is yes. So the most critical time for kids to have clean air, or for people to have clean air, is when they're kids. And I get very angry every time I go down the street and see people pushing their kid in a push cart, and there's a diesel vehicle spewing fumes out at the level of the kid's face. So it's just got to stop. But yes, it causes permanent damage, and the kids who are exposed a lot. So, for example, if they go to a school which is right next to a highway, where there's a lot of diesel traffic, their lungs don't fully develop. So something like 10% less in size, which as you get older builds up. And when you're very young and you're healthy, you have an overcapacity in your lungs. But as you get older, you need that capacity. So if the lungs are actually stunted by pollution, it will cause, it's storing up problems for later in life.
Yeah. There was a question earlier about how radical, this is Ruby asking, do you think breaking the law in protest is necessary? Is it okay? Have we reached the stage where it's okay to carry out more extreme forms of demonstration? There was that example recently, wasn't there, of somebody throwing paint at the High Court building, red paint, I think, that caused consternation in some circles as vandalism.
Yes, well, it's a very interesting question. And I'll tell you my personal answer, but I wouldn't do it myself. But on the other hand, you may come to a time when you think it is a valid choice. I'll give you an example of, back in 12 years ago, Greenpeace and we were both working on preventing 6 coal-fired power stations from being built in the UK. Ed Miliband, pretty nice guy, was the energy secretary, and they were still, and it was a Labour administration, but they were going to build these 6 coal-fired power stations. So we spent a long time working on a big lawsuit, and Greenpeace did a protest in which they climbed the smokestack of one of the plants that was existing and right next to where they were going to build a new one. So, and it was criminal trespass. They did this intentionally. They intended to trespass. They intended to be caught. They intended to be, charged with a crime. And then they intended to, in front of the jury, say, but this is, but a much bigger crime is building this coal-fired power station, because it will harm all of humanity and will be one of the things that tips us over the edge. And they took that risk, and very interestingly, they put on a good case with one of the world's best climate scientists, and they convinced the jury that even though this was criminal trespass, they should not be have any penalties, because they were doing this for a higher purpose, and the disaster that they were trying to avert gave them the ability to do this and get off. Now, that's a really interesting example. And will we see more of that in coming years in various ways? Well, we might. And might it be appropriate? Well, that'll be up to you.
So overall, I imagine you think the Biden administration is going to going to be very good news in terms of what will change?
Holy moly, yes, compared to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, so I was drawing this graph in the air earlier. We can either really change our ways and we can thrive. London can be best place in the world in 15 years and everything can be very cool. And we can have a new vision of life that we all create together. I mean, I deeply believe this and it's up to us, we can do that. Or we can go down the tubes. And Donald Trump was doing everything he possibly could to push us down the tubes as fast as possible. So even simply him going off into the sunset to the degree he has was great. But yes, Biden, so wow. He has put together the greatest, pretty much the greatest team that you could with of talent in the United States to address climate change. Climate change and racial inequalities and economic inequality are unbelievably high on his agenda, and he's got unbelievably good people working on it. So I have some of whom I know, many of whom I don't, but I have great hope. The only problem is that he doesn't, so Boris Johnson has an 80-person majority in the House of Commons, and this is not the same luxury that Biden has in the United States. So everything, if you want to pass legislation, has to go through both houses, like in London. And in the Senate, they will have, so it's 50-50. And then Kamala Harris, the great Kamala Harris, has the deciding vote. But boy, that's close. What that means is a lot of the more radical things that he would like to do are probably not going to be able to get done. So very cleverly, to go back to the economic question, one of the things that they're looking at doing, which I think is enormously smart, is simply building in lots and lots of green stuff into the bills that have to get passed because of their bills on funding this and bills on funding that and bills on funding this, and they'll put a little bit of the big vision into 100 different laws, and a lot of them will be about creating jobs in the green economy. So everyone will like them. And if that works as a strategy, what's really cool is then they've changed the architecture of how everything happens. They've changed the structure in this very subtle, hard to argue with way. So there won't be a big flashy law, but they'll, if this works, they'll change the mechanism of the clock. So Trump was trying to, take the hammer to the clock, and what they're trying to do is to make the clock work very smoothly for a green outcome. And I have high hopes for it. But how else am I going to get through the day? I mean, I have to have high hopes for it.
Are there any other questions out there? Come on, there must be some more. This is your opportunity. I do actually have a parent who would like to ask you a question. Anita,
Sure.
Are you still there?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, do you want to come in now and ask?
Yeah, that would be fantastic, James. It's such a pleasure. I mean, just full disclosure here, I used to be head of ESG and responsible investment at M&G Investments, and I've worked in impact financing, and I'm a fixed income person by trade, so green bonds is my area. I'm also a student, and I'm doing my thesis right now and looking at the links between climate change and biodiversity loss. And I've got a very specific question.
Yeah.
The Rio Tinto debacle last year, where they blew up the Aborigine caves,
Yeah.
I learned for the first time about heritage legislation. I hadn't heard about heritage legislation. So the heritage legislation protecting these Aboriginal caves. I just wondered, what's your thoughts and your perspectives? Do you think we might eventually see biodiversity legislation that protects endangered biodiversity? So there's extinction risk and extirpation risk. So extirpation is localized risk.
Yes.
Extinction is the dinosaurs going. I would be really keen to hear your thoughts on whether we might see some legislation on biodiversity.
Well, I mean, there is biodiversity legislation, which is decent in the EU and in the United States. In much of the rest of the world, not so great, like Australia, which has so much unique biodiversity, not very great protection. And actually in the United States and in Europe, yes, I think in Europe, but certainly in the United States, you do have this, this ability to protect local local biodiversity. So under the Endangered Species Act, and I've done that in the United States. It doesn't have to be a global destruction of a species for you to be able to protect it. So that happens in some places, but the laws for biodiversity protection are very, very poor, and indeed the laws on climate are very, very poor. So we were talking earlier about if you want to attack public enemy number one, which is coal, and shortly behind that, car emissions. You need to be clever about how to do it. So even there, the laws aren't that great. But in biodiversity protection, very poor. So the good news is that there is a global biodiversity meeting happening in Kunming, China, in November, and just very close, assuming both the climate COP and the biodiversity COP happen, depending on COVID, they're both happening very close to each other in time, opposite sides of the planet. And that one has the potential of being as important for biodiversity as the Paris Agreement was for climate, because over the last decade, biodiversity, as you will know, has plunged. I mean, there was a WWF report that was quite authoritative that says that in I forget exactly the time span, very recent, 25 years.
Yeah, it was 1970 to date.
Yeah.
2/3 of biodiversity loss has been.
Yeah, precisely. Well, and there's 70% of all animals have been lost, and I mean that's incredible, and nobody knows it very much, because we don't see that. And if you were going on a safari, you'd still see animals, but this what they were looking at is the total number of wild animals all over the planet has gone down 70% in the last 40 years, and that's it can't keep on too much longer without massive permanent damage. The good news is that if you do something about it, a lot of this can recover, and a lot of it can recover. We're losing species, that's for sure, but a lot of it can be recovered. I was talking to a great marine scientist called Sylvia Earle, who's a marvelous character. She's quite elderly now, but she still goes deep sea diving, and she's a National Geographic explorer. And she was saying, I was saying, well, more than 90% of all the sharks have already been killed. This is depressing. And she said, well, that's one way to look at it. Think about it this way. If we wake up tomorrow and protect the sharks, the brilliant news is we've still got 10% of them left. We can bring them back. And I changed my perspective on everything, essentially, in that conversation with Sylvia. So massive biodiversity loss, immense opportunity at this global meeting to come up with new global framework for protecting biodiversity. And the basic idea that is going around, which you will have heard of, Anita, is among the biologists, is we need to protect 30% of the terrestrial ecosystems by 2030 and 30% of the oceans by 2030, and then 50% by 2050 of both. And then that gets more complicated, but that's the basic idea. And then we bring things back. But the laws need to improve a lot. And the first place where this could happen would be this global framework. Finally, some governments are getting totally scared that we're about to lose nature. I mean, we're going to watch it just go down. Well, we won't even see it. It'll just happen. But it can be stopped, and this is an opportunity. And then what you need is laws like you're talking about on a country-by-country level that are quite good and tie into the overall big framework in which, say, Kenya has said we're going to protect 30% of our land. And you have to figure out what does that actually mean? How do you protect and what are you protecting? And then it has to be a law that citizens can enforce. That governments are interested in, citizens can enforce. And part of the argument is always going to be, this is better for the people, better for the economy. And we know that's true. And we work in 5 African countries and protect forests. And we know that the local populations of people are much better off economically when you protect the forest. And they protect the forest. And then you save the biodiversity and you save this enormous storage capacity of carbon as well that the forest provides. Much better to do that than to plant new trees. I'm all for planting new trees, but saving the great forests is even more effective. So all of these things go together, I think, and the opportunity to protect nature is really there. So you're doing the right PhD.
I'm actually looking at the interconnectivity of biodiversity loss and climate change.
Yes, good.
And yeah, this inextricable link between ecosystem health and animal health.
Yes.
And human health and zoonotic diseases and all that. But
yes. Well,
maybe we can speak.
There's a very good book I was reading recently by, it's called Rewilding the Radical Science. It's a small book, and it's by.
Oh, that's good. I like small books.
But that's a very good one. It's called Rewilding the Radical Science of climate change or of nature protection, something like that. But there's only one book with Rewilding the Radical Science, and the author's name begins with a P. It's not in my mind at the moment, but it's a book that you will genuinely like because it's short, it's very clear, and it looks at the connections between nature protection and climate protection, and gives you a globally applicable theory of what you need to do in protecting nature, that you can move from ecosystem to ecosystem to ecosystem. So it's the first time I've seen an ecologist do that, and it's very powerful, I think, and I'm a great fan of it. And we're taking his theory into this meeting in China, where we're the advisors to China, by the way. We were talking about China earlier. China asked us to advise them on how they should run the meeting and what they should say, and they are very keen on doing something right here, because the host, that's why we wrote the letter to Boris Johnson saying, please don't build this mine. You're the host of the climate meeting. And what the host does is hugely determinative of what can get done. If you're smart, if you're pragmatic, if you're progressive, you can get a lot done, because a lot of countries want to do it now on climate. But similarly on biodiversity, there are a lot of countries that now want to do something, and China actually is already close to protecting 30% of its land surface, and that gets harder for other countries, and in the Netherlands, very hard to protect 30%. So you have to say, what does that actually mean? So you get into more complicated conversations, but as a basic idea, it's a very powerful and good idea. But have a look at that book, and if you can't find it, Margaret has my email, and you can get in touch.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Probably related to that, James, is Harry asking, what will the impact of lost nature be if it happens?
Well, there are lots of impacts, So one of them, an important one, is what you might call spiritual or aesthetic. Imagine knowing that there are no more giraffes in the wild anymore. What would that be like for you? I mean, for me, it would be a disaster. I'd hate that. My life would be less valuable in my own. It would be less enjoyable. It would be less rich. It would be less meaningful. And the conservation of giraffes is a serious issue at the moment. We actually could see that in coming decades unless we act. So that's one part of it. But also, at a very fundamental level, it's the forests and animals are what keep us alive. So oxygen is recycled by essentially by trees and plankton. And without them, we're in trouble. Nature is where we got all of our crops, and all of our food crops have wild family members that we are very likely to need to keep growing our crops in a healthy way. So that's a very practical example. But without those, our food sources may be diminished. So, it's aesthetic, it's whether you keep breathing, and one of the, and of course it's food too. I mean, for much of humanity, one of the main protein sources is from wild fish. And in many parts of the world, wild fish populations are close to crashing. They can come back, and if they're well managed. And it's now known how to manage them pretty well. So you could keep them very safe for the rest of history. And I always talk about having, you want to see both fishermen or fisher people and fish, in good shape 100 years from now. Quite possible. But if you keep overfishing, the population crashes. And if you really do it, then the fish population disappears. And there's a great example of that in Georges Bank in Canada with the world's largest cod stock. It was overfished so much for so long that 30 years of non-fishing hasn't brought it back. And it's unclear whether it will ever come back. Now, if you do that with all the fish populations around the world, one of the main sources of humanity's food goes. That's another example. Plankton, as I said, is one of the main recyclers of oxygen. You need it, and in the system, and plankton. So it's throughout the oceans, in vast quantities, and the green plankton, chlorophyll plankton. And if we make the oceans too acidic, you begin to challenge the ability of those organisms to survive. So that's not an asteroid, but you don't want to go out, asphyxiated, and that's conceivable, if we cut down the forests and destroy all the plankton. So those are some examples of why you want to keep nature going, for the love of it, to keep people healthy, and to keep people fed.
Talking about oceans, could I ask, is our recycling really recycled? Why are the oceans full of our plastic?
Well, lots of reasons. I mean, we make way too much plastic. We throw away too much plastic. A lot of it isn't recyclable, and winds up in the ocean. But the main, so those are the main reasons. I mean, we make way too much of it, and a lot of it is single use, and we throw it away. And then so we shouldn't be making so much plastic, and we shouldn't be making plastic that you can't recycle. And then plastic can be useful, certainly, but it can be made in a very nice way, and a very nice high quality way, with no toxic materials embedded in it, and then recycled. But that's not what we require. There is no law requiring that. So again, citizens have to get active. And here's something I'll tell you that I don't mean to depress you near the end of our time together, but the fossil fuel interests have what they call a Plan B. There's their name for it, not mine. Sounds like a conspiracy theory, and it sort of is, but it's the fossil fuel industries. So they foresee that they're going to be selling less gas and natural gas and oil, because countries are getting hit to climate change, but they don't want to sell less of it. This is back to being an incumbent industry that we were talking about earlier, a dinosaur. And they know very well that that's the feedstock for plastic. You make plastic out of fossil fuels. So they want to greatly increase the number of plastic making factories. And that's the plan. So one of the first big new ones of this type was to be built in Europe, in the Netherlands, by a company called Ineos, one of the biggest plastics manufacturers, owned by a very difficult businessman called Jim Ratcliffe in the UK, who spent a lot of money and time arguing for Brexit, and then moved away after Brexit. Anyway, he was building a $3 billion plastics manufacturing facility, a lot of it for single-use plastics in the Netherlands, and that would have contributed a lot to ocean plastic. And we sued them, and we closed that down. But that's the sort of thing you have to do now. You have to, like with coal-fired power stations, there needs to be a concerted effort to simply prevent the increase of all of this, while you begin, like we are also with coal, to shut down systematically the manufacture of this single-use plastics.
Right. Well, one of our students is saying, interestingly, Daniel is saying his uncle co-authored the book that you mentioned.
Oh, good.
We have to ask.
Excellent. Oh, terrific. Yeah. Well, then Anita can come to you if she can't find the book. That's great. What's your uncle's name?
Daniel, can you hear that? What's your uncle's name? Oh, he's put up the name of it, Rewilding, the Radical Science of Ecological Recovery.
That's it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what's your uncle's name? Kane Blythe.
Very good. Terrific. Wonderful work. I mean, it's my favorite book on how to save nature of recent years. It's just great. And it's what's great about it is there's also, it's short, it's really clear.
Sounds like we should all read that.
I would really recommend it. I'd be interested to see what ideas it brings up for all of you. I mean, it's the sort of thing, since it's talking about nature and that might spark artistic endeavor.
Right. And there's a question from Maya. Do you think overpopulation is an important environmental issue?
Yes, I do. And it's a somewhat complicated issue because there are an awful lot of people on the planet. But the amount that those people consume varies enormously from country to country. So that Africans' carbon footprint is a very small fraction of Americans' carbon footprint. So you have countries where population is continuing to go up, but where the impact per person is actually much smaller than in first world countries. So it's not an easy issue to work on. But there's a simple solution really, which is women's empowerment. So it's really quite clear that in countries that have bring in good education systems for girls and women and create economic opportunities, that they make life choices that are very, very different, and the number of children they decide to have is much lower. So there's a solution to this, which starts with human rights and taking care of women in the developing world.
Right. Well, we've kept you a long time, James. That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thanks for great questions too. There's nothing as good as a tough group. So
that was a good discussion, wasn't it? It was really good.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for all your.
Thank you very much.
It was really interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks. Good. A pleasure. And thank you, Fred, for getting me involved.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, James, I just want to introduce you properly to Anita, if that's all right.
Yes, of course.
Because she just wanted me. Anita, do you just want to?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you, James. I've met many of your colleagues over the years when I used to work in asset management.
Yes.
And so my real focus is ecological loss and deforestation, biodiversity loss, and I'm writing my thesis right now on it, and I'm trying to look at, in fact, the title of my thesis is evidencing the need for a science-based approach to sustainable investing. So I'm actually a responsible investor previously, and I work for Citigroup, and I head up the ESG there, and my target is institutional investors, clients. Those are my clients, and I'm sort of banging the drum for climate change and biodiversity loss, and it seems to be having its moment today because of the Pyongyang biodiversity COP, because of the pandemic, because of the zoonotic diseases, because of the overpopulation and unsustainable consumption and production models. So I've done a fair amount of research in the area over the years, and I'm just exploring right now whether a framework is needed for the financial community, because we often hear this lament from investors, oh, we just don't have the metrics and the targets and the frameworks. But that's where we were in 2012. And we witnessed, I mean, you have witnessed this, you've been catalytic in this. We've witnessed this upskilling Whereas we're now, I mean, I'm with my investment colleagues now, and they're speaking with total fluency about climate and Paris and 1.5 and temperature alignment and decarbonisation. We don't have 8 years today to tackle the biodiversity crisis, and biodiversity and climate change, two sides of the same coin. And by building resilience into our ecosystems, that's also part of the solution to tackling climate change. So I'm just really curious, because having spent most of my career in asset management and with fund managers creating new investment solutions, just really curious about the need for a new narrative. The nomenclature has changed. There's definite receptivity. Investors are keen. They want to be part of the solution, but then they feel a bit paralyzed because we don't have metrics and targets. I want to get past that, because if they really, they know, as you say, Mark Carney, climate risk is financial risk, but they still don't understand the materiality of ecological loss and biodiversity loss. We've got work to do there. I think I'm unlocking a framework. So, Margaret very kindly offered to introduce me to you. I was very excited when I saw that you were hosting this webinar for the children. I don't think they realise how lucky they are to have had this time with you today. Maybe they'll all go and tell their parents afterwards. But yeah, I'd love to get your sort of academic perspective, because there is a disconnect between the scientists and responsible investors. And as you know, if we could just pivot a percentage of the trillions of dollars that's invested into long-term sustainable solutions and pivot them away from the problem, it could be profound. So that is what I'm trying to do, is to unpick that. I think I've got a framework. I've road tested it. I'd love to share it with you.
Oh, sure. I'd love to see it.
And
I mean, so this is a discussion internally now. So as you correctly say, we've been working on this on climate for some time, and we actually started. My chair and I and Cameron Hepburn, who runs the Smith School in Oxford.
Yes, we do quite a bit with the Smith School.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, in order to try and get this idea that climate risk equals financial risk, when nobody had heard of it, we wrote a paper in Nature about 5 years ago, and laid out the climate change equals financial risk equals or triggers fiduciary duty. And now I hear everyone saying that, and I think, wow, isn't that great? I want them all to think it's their own idea, And I wonder if some fundamental thing like that doesn't need to be done. Say a paper in Nature as a starting point. But so internally, where the discussion is that with that framework, which is so good on climate, now the people in the forests team and the plastics team and potentially agriculture team are beginning to say, how can we use a similar framework, essentially the same framework with different elements, to say that these are material risks. So that investing, I mean, and on the one level, the easiest part of it would be like, you argue that investing $3 billion in a new plastics factory is investing in a stranded asset. I mean, so that's a bit easier than figuring out how to make the argument for a rainforest or for a fisheries resource. But anyway, this is an internal discussion, and what we're doing is we're trying to get a cohesive framework across different, I guess you could call them media, but whether it's climate or forests or plastics, and along the different dimensions.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about that, because what I did uncover in my research, and I know that you've been on this Zoom for a long time, so you probably need to have a Zoom break. So maybe we could find another time to chat, just so we can all, I'm sure you might need a break after speaking to the children for so long. But look, it was in the IPCC report in 2013 or 2014. They talk about the need for cross-sectoral solutions. I was amazed when I found it in there. But if you look at the IPCC report, they literally mention it twice. And then it's picked up by the academic community. And there was some very good literature that came out about the need to be thinking cross-sectorally, recognizing the indivisibility of these issues and recognizing the interlinkages. Now, that really resonates with the financial community because investment professionals, fund managers, it's all about portfolio diversification. It's about constructing across different sectors and industries. But what they don't realize is that, and Sandra Diaz wrote about this. She works with IPBES, and she's been part of the IPBES, which is the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. She talks about, and I'm really hang on to her phrase. She's an academic. She says the sustainability, the biodiversity goals are within reach. Like you say, species do bounce back, but no single action will get us there. And I've borrowed her phrase and adapted it. The biodiversity, sustainability, and climate goals are within reach, but no single action will get us there. So it's a recalibration, and this is what the financial community needs. They get into a rut, and they're all scrambling around right now, trying to create the best impact fund, or the best SDG aligned fund, or the best climate fund. And I've sat there and worked with these fund managers without realizing or thinking academically about it. And because they're not harnessing the latest science, there's a big piece missing from their investment thesis.
Sure.
And that's the bit that I'm focused on, is how do we unlock that such that the financial community feels empowered and they reclaim the narrative, because there's a lot of this feeling, they're disembodied, they bemoan the fact they don't have the metrics, and it's like, okay, let's just get past that. Let's just actually adopt systems level thinking and think, right, what am I actually trying to do here, and what's the financial product that I'm trying to create, and what's the solution I'm trying to create.
Well, that's all extremely interesting. And if you have, you mentioned having an outline or an analysis, I mean, I'd be very happy to share it with my colleagues, and maybe we can reflect together on it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a little bit shy of producing it because I haven't. I'm just on my research methods, and I'm just about to go in.
Oh no, I get it. It's very
I'm
early,
just going into the whole
got it.
Data collection.
No.
I'm actually doing my Viva very soon, so I can share that with you, because it's all mapped out. But yeah, it'd be great if you don't mind me contacting you again, because I wouldn't mind asking you.
And then I'm not actually the best person to work on the details of it, but I can put you in touch with a couple of colleagues that you may not have met, who are actually actively saying, how can we work not just on climate change, but on these other things, and with a similar type of analysis. That ultimately gets down to fiduciary duty and materiality.
Exactly. And it's interesting. It's interesting because, like you mentioned the pensions, institutional investors. There's lots of levers here.
Sure.
And if we, the asset owners, if they start asking the questions, the asset managers jump. So equipping them with the narrative and a framework will galvanize investors into action. But equally, investors, they want to reclaim this narrative and stop being reactive.
Sure.
And but yeah, it's still trying to get to the crux of materiality, which is the holy grail of ESG.
Yes, well, and it's relatively easy with climate, and it's harder with these super complex systems. But so that's what we're thinking about. But it will be possible to do something, that's for sure. And none of us, we all must leave no stone unturned until we get there. So, but it is great to know that you're working on this, and do be in touch, and then we'll plug you into the dialogue.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for letting me join into the webinar. I thought the kids asked great questions.
They did, yeah. Questions I've never been asked before, which is always fun. That's great.
There might still be. There's a student, I think, still waiting patiently to ask something. Francis.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm here.
Are you still there? Do you want to ask your question now?
Okay, one more, because I do actually have to go in a minute, but go ahead.
And I'm going to say goodbye.
Okay,
Thank you so
bye-bye.
much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Go on,
It's
Francis.
very fast. It's more of a request, to be honest.
Yeah.
I asked the question about Cumbria because I'm originally from Cumbria.
Okay, right.
I've lived there most of my life, apart from moving down to London about a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, my family, we've put a lot of money, etc., into preserving our land around us and the nature, the habitats which are inside that, and the proposed coal mine is going to be in Whitehaven, which is located to the west of where my family's land is. With the prevailing wind, which blows east, all of the emissions produced by that coal mine are going to blow onto that, probably kill off all of the habitat, which means that the animals and nature have nothing to feed off, and it'll just all go so terribly wrong. And I've been following it, so I was glad that you were here to speak to.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I think it's just a terrible thing. There is a local group of residents there. I don't know if I can find it right now, but what I can do is there's a local group who is opposing it that you might, if you don't know them, be interested in being in touch with, and I can get that to Margaret.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
Yeah.
But like, if anything that you and your corporation could do to help it, that would be utterly incredible.
Yes, well, we're looking at it. I mean, if the this group, whose name is not in my mind, is working with some very good lawyers who are experts in planning law, and they're environmentalists themselves, and they would do a very good job if this becomes a case. So that's also good news, you know, that these good lawyers are working with this local group on it. But I'll try and remember to get to Margaret the name of this group so that you can be in touch with them, because if you don't know them, I'm sure you would want to.
Yeah.
That's great. I'll pass it to you, Francis.
Thank you, Margaret.
Okay, James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Thank you.
For all your time. I can't thank you enough. The students were very engaged. I mean, that's, you know.